This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, wow. All right. Welcome to our first of two spring PDs. The first one is on architecture and making it matter. I did want to take a quick note to say that this PD came about because we had a suggestion in our Facebook group that it would be a great topic. So my ask to you is our PD is only as good as our members. If you have a suggestion, email Donna, email Tracy, email one of us at the PD, post on Facebook. And please, when we send you a survey, it takes a quick couple of minutes, fill it out. And the more information we have on the group and what we're looking for, the better PDs we can bring to you. So on to our session. John Leroux has practiced in the fields of art, history, architecture, visual art, curation, and education, and is currently the manager of collections and exhibitions at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in his hometown of Fredericton. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from McGill, a Master of Arts in Art History from Concordia, and a PhD in History from the University of New Brunswick. He has worked at several award-winning architecture firms in Toronto, Atlanta, and Fredericton, and has taught at the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design, the University of New Brunswick, and St. Thomas University. He has won many awards for architectural and public art projects throughout Canada, and he was a team member of Canada's entry to the 2012 Venice Biennale in Architecture. A passionate advocate for the arts and for Architectural Conservancy, John has authored 16 books on architecture and visual culture, including A Vision in Wood and Stone, The Architecture of Mount Allison University, In Building New Brunswick, and Architectural History. He has been an architectural tour guide for over 30 years. John has generously shared some resources that are posted in our National PD tab in the Travel Media website. And he's also offered to be a resource for us, for any of us that are writing stories and have any architecture questions. If you have any questions during the session, please pop them into the chat and we can ask those to John after the session. And now please help me in welcoming John Leroux.
All right, thanks. I can see your hands go, so I know how to follow. Thank you so much. Look, it's a pleasure to be here, and I see my friend Mary Ellen Hudson from Fredericton Tourism is on here too. Hey, Mary Ellen. I've worked with Mary Ellen for years in basically as an advocate for our region, but also working with travel writers. And I try to never say no, and I have a lot of respect and a lot of time for your profession. So thank you for what you do. It's important. Just personally, I've worked in I guess you'd say the tourism industry for a while. I used to be an actor in a summer theater company, but we would give all the tours of Fredericton. So I've been a tour guide for over 30 years. And I know how important it is to kind of get it right and to connect with people. And, it's just so important that you can really have something that's an exquisite experience. So thank you for everything. So let me get my share screen here and we'll get right into it. There we go. Okay. And slideshow, play from start. There we go. Okay, thumbs up. Can you hear me okay? Everything's good? Okay, great. I'm also going to put up the chat line here. Okay, I can see the chat line. So if anyone has any questions during the slide, if there's something, you see something and you really want to know at that time what it is, don't hesitate, put it up on the chat and I'll try to answer it as best I can if I see it. It doesn't bother me at all. I know we're going to have some Q&A after. But here we go, architecture, making it all matter. As I said, I've been essentially an architecture tour guide. Whenever you give tours of a region, unless you're in a national park or in a wildlife area or even if you're in Central Park and you're constantly surrounded by buildings, typically the tours and tourists will be in an area which is immersed in the built form, in architecture and engineering, roads, whether it's airports, schools, museums, residences. We're constantly surrounded by it. And I will say one thing, rare is the time that I will see a travel writer really dig in, not that they do a job poorly, but they rarely immerse themselves deeply into the real kind of meaning beyond sort of the very sort of superficial of that. And I understand it. Oftentimes it's about time or not knowing it, but sometimes there's deep meaning and just interesting stories behind the architecture that can become much more fascinating than sometimes, you know, I think than just often what's on the surface. So if I can get into this, here we go. Whoop. All right. This absolutely looks like me and my wife in front of a big wall sticker. It looks so flat, but it's really at Falling Water back in 2005. It is a real photograph of us at Falling Water. It's just very misty on the waterfall, so it just looks very flat. So one of the big things to me, and I'm the converted, I love traveling. Architecture is one of the biggest reasons I travel, and one of the big reasons that most people do. Cultural history and so on. Here we are at Falling Water, one of the great buildings of the 20th century, and arguably the greatest house built by an American architect, of Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's an enormous draw in a fairly kind of rural area outside of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. But when you think about architecture as well, you can have sort of the majestic, the monumental, things like the Great Pyramids. I mean, literally the symbol of Egypt. Some of the oldest structures, man-made built structures in the world, one of the last, the only existing ancient seven wonders of the world. And you think something like this would have absolutely nothing in common with, you know, an ephemeral birch bark wigwam, which would have been built in the Maritimes and, you know, up till maybe 150 years ago, where the indigenous lived. But they have remarkable similarities. And when you talk about one or the other, not that you have to talk about the pyramids and compare them to wigwams, but when you look at the wigwams, you think about what makes them different. Materials, you know, scale, history, and so on, obviously the region. But think about the things that make them shared, have these shared sensibilities. This sort of very conical form, built by untrained people, the need for something that sort of functions, that also not only speaks to whether it's shelter or have a certain sort of semi-permanence, but the idea, the reason the pyramids are the shape that they are is almost exactly the same reason that the shape of the wigwams are. If it's pure efficiency, it's a cone. If you take a bunch of sand, you pour it down, it'll basically make a cone shaped. And so the same idea, if you pile millions and millions of tons of stone, you can't do something straight up vertical, not 4,000 years ago. So it's the same reason that these are. It's about pure efficiency and so on. So it's one of the things, I think, one of the biggest aspects I would always try to do when I would ever speak about architecture or give a tour, whether it's written form or actually, you know, an oral depiction of it, is not about getting tied down to dates and names and sort of kind of banal, like call it like textbook history. It's never about that. It's about getting stories and about finding things that resonate. Like, for example, that a lot of people wouldn't know that, you know, somebody, you think about sustainability today, possibly the most sustainable, environmentally green buildings ever built in the history of Eastern Canada were wigwams. They're made out of birch bark and posts. They were reusable, they were movable, they're transportable. They were basically, you know, the minivans of their day, and they would last sort of forever. That understanding how architecture sort of works is really the key to making people kind of connect with those from far back. When you think of a city like Montreal, which is so architecturally rich in Canada, and I know you all know well, I was lucky enough to live there for a few years. Architecture is one of the first things that comes to mind, whether it's, you know, the majestic Gothic revival Notre Dame Cathedral downtown in Old Montreal, with its beautiful lit ceiling with the stars and so on. It's just an absolutely beautiful place. A friend of mine was lucky enough to get married there. It was great. As you know, Pierre Trudeau's funeral was in there too. But then you also have the 3-story walk-ups with their wonderful metal stairs that are all around. And I guess one of the questions that you ask is, they're so ubiquitous, but why are they the way they are? Why was the Gothic used at this time? Why is the ceiling blue? What does it kind of evoke? What ancient models, you know, of medieval times, you know, does it kind of align with? Finding those reasons out. It's not just about describing sort of the style. I mean, you say sort of a Gothic, it's a replica of medieval to a point, but Notre Dame, in a way, doesn't really look like a medieval cathedral. It has the language, but it's very much 19th century. And in Montreal, you have these staircases, which are kind of unlike any other city in Canada. And you ask them, why is that? Well, it's because they had these weird zoning laws, and this density of Montreal grew so quick and so fast that they allowed these these metal staircase happen that actually, and interesting, by the National Building Code of Canada, you could not build these today. So it's one of those things, there's stories like that that are kind of interesting about how to speak about some things. Were very much sort of their time at this sort of practical bit, but become ubiquitous to the character of a place. And I think writing about that and understanding the spirit of how they become and what makes this city very different from others. But one thing I really like to talk about as well is that Montreal, you think about these older buildings in the 19th century, but it has some of the most important 20th century buildings of the entire planet. You think of Expo 67, which some of you may have been lucky enough to go to before I was born, but two of the most important 20th century buildings in Canada are these two right here, which were built for Expo 67 at a time when modernism was coming and changing the way architecture was functioning. So Habitat 67 at the bottom, which is all about kind of housing. Everyone's talking about housing now and the homeless in Canada and in the US, but housing was an issue even up to the 60s with the baby boom and thinking about new materials and concrete, but also the geodesic dome, which was a US pavilion in 1967, which is now a museum. So some of these, Habitat is still an apartment building. It's the exact same use it always has had, done by an architect still living, Moshe Safdie, a really important Canadian architect. But the upper was done as the American Pavilion, and it actually had a monorail that kind of zipped through. So if you talk about both of these, when you talk about, say, the Montreal earlier, the more historic buildings I showed, you could talk about them maybe kind of in some stylistic contexts about the local. But if you're talking about these Expo 67 buildings, you have to put them in a global context because these are some of the most important buildings ever built. And that's why when people will either go visit them or read what you're writing about, they get riveted and they'll want to see them. Because it's not simply that it's just a huge dome. This was actually the biggest geodesic dome built at the time by one of the most important, by Buckminster Fuller, who changed engineering as we know it in the 20th century. It's just finding those stories. It's making the stories, getting those deep connections. Or how, if anyone's ever been to Bilbao, Spain, which is in northern Spain, which was kind of it was sort of the Hamilton of Spain. And I've been to Hamilton. I like Hamilton, but industrial kind of Rust Belt. Bilbao was a town on the decline, and it was an industrial town. Nothing was happening. Factories were closing. So the Spanish government hired the most famous architect in the world, who happened to be a Canadian, Frank Gehry, to design a Guggenheim art museum there. And it transformed not only the city as a tourist destination, but it changed architecture in the world. That really, you get the most famous architect doing what's regarded as the most important art building of the early 20th century. And it's Guggenheim. Everyone knows the Guggenheim name for modern art. And you talk about this, it's sort of clad in titanium, and it transformed the tourism industry and the draw. This is now one of the greatest tourism draws in Spain, if not all of Europe. And it was a city that was absolutely off the beaten track. And so if you're to write about something like the Bilbao Museum, you have Frank Gehry, about him as an architect, the other works that he's done, but about also the history of where this came from, where the city was before this. It's essentially a dead town that architecture can help sort of save it. And it's just a beautiful experience in walking through it. And I got a question just right before the session about how would you describe architecture today? Is there a style? I mean, you think there's classical revival or Art Deco. There's certain styles names. There's not really a style per se today. It's so eclectic. But if you did write about architecture sort of in the last 20 years, the term is actually contemporary because it's really of today. A lot of people will use the term modern for, if they look at this, they go, oh, it's a very modern building. It's technically wrong because the modern era in architecture ended about 1970. I mean, we use it. I'll even use it sometimes, but it's not technically correct. It represents a very specific time. So if you're writing about something brand new, you'd say contemporary. For all of the different styles, and there's a lot of things, the resources I gave sort of an illustrated, very quick synopsis of a lot of the architectural styles of the last 200 years, certainly all the ones in Canada, and they're in the piece that you have as well. But some of it is knowing these social reasons as to why this building was built there. It was to help save the economy of a region, and it makes the building matter more. This is an interesting one too, a very, very modern building. This is actually a whiskey distillery in northern Scotland. It's the Macallan Distillery. So if anyone's ever enjoyed a dram of Macallan, in the last couple of years, it's come from here. You can see that typically it doesn't look very Scottish or traditional, as you would see the kind of brick warehouses up top, but they knew they wanted architecture to speak to a new spirit of something global, that whiskey is now a global phenomenon, and it's expensive, but it has a certain level of prestige and quality. So the architecture here resonates and absolutely connects with the sensibilities of whiskey, that sense of craft, of quality, of something you treasure, something that lasts. And they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this. But now people go to Macallan, not just simply for the distillery tour, but to visit this, one of the most interesting architectural buildings in Europe, where actually the top is also green because it's sort of, it's an insulated, grass insulated building. It's very efficient. It holds the water. It kind of looks like the Scottish moors. It sort of fits with the landscape. So if you were to write or talk about this, you'd also notice by the stills in the bottom, it does two things. It evokes the sense of the kind of the pot stills that the distillery, the sort of humps that the distillery is made in, or the whiskey is distilled in. But it also speaks to the landscape of just below the Highlands of Scotland. So I think one of the things is, if you were to write about something like this, you'd want to deeply immerse yourself in the idea of whiskey, but also the landscape. It's doing really some interesting things. And why did they build it? Because, well, also they have a crap load of money now, because whiskey distilleries are making all kinds of money. So they spend it in this. It's about the visitor experience. I think in understanding architecture, again, getting away from just sort of dates and sometimes even characters and people, it matters sometimes, but when you visit a place like this, Wells Cathedral in England, which is one of the great Gothic cathedrals in the United Kingdom, and very distinct from it. It's very kind of chunky and monumental. But what it's really well known for, and we think of these as sort of, again, ancient and not backwards, but the Middle Ages, we have this reference of it's something that's so far back, but we forget about, people often overlook the sophistication, the engineering sophistication of the time. And when you talk about this, the Gothic arch, the ribs, the structural advances this time was insanely avant-garde at the time for what was able to be built before. That sense of being able to bring in light and height. These were incredibly progressive buildings. And we look at this one in Wells, it has this wonderful, it is kind of very evocative, almost looks like an angry face or like an owl or something, this great sort of cross vaulting that was in the front. Just this idea of writing about why these things were made and how those Gothic ribs were very much an engineering marvel at the time. And the neat thing about Wells, it's actually most known for one of the most famous architectural photographs ever taken. This is called Sea of Steps. It was done in 1903, but the photographer was Frederick Evans. And you just can see on this, it's actually, sorry, it's not a great high-res image, but just a sense of the wear of, hundreds and hundreds centuries of wear on these as they sort of flow up. And it fits that sort of character of age, but also sort of the cross vaulting of Wells. So thinking about how sometimes there's very famous either films have been shot in places or photographs or elements like this, that you may know. I spoke at length last summer about a very famous hotel called the Hotel del Coronado outside San Diego in California. And it's where Marilyn Monroe filmed Some Like It Hot as part of it. But also a neat thing, Willie O'Ree, the first Black player in the NHL, who happens to be from Fredericton, before he got hired by the NHL in the 1990s as their diversity coordinator, he actually was the head security guard at the Hotel del Coronado. So finding out those little things like that, those actually make things really, really kind of resonate. Thinking about photography as well, and about if you're ever giving a tour, speaking of a place, again, it's not always just about the specifics, but about how a place feels and that sense that you get standing in front of it. This is a wonderful Baptist church in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. Without a spire, you can see it has the finials, the towers coming out. But one of the things that you think it's one of the most photogenic places in New Brunswick is you get this sense of almost these sort of horns in front, these sort of hovering kind of places. So if you were to write about this as the Gothic, you'd write about this front of this building very differently than you would of Wells, without having this sort of spire. This, what does a church with horns make you feel? I don't want to get into the kind of religious symbolism of this kind of thing, but kind of know where I'm going about that. And so I think it's one of the places why it becomes so sort of memorable in write about how it makes you feel, because that's what you want to talk about. worrying about the exact year of something doesn't matter so much. I mean, there's always a place for it, but I mean, if you're to write about this church, it's about sort of the qualities of sort of how it kind of feels walking by, but also sometimes those hidden stories. This is Christ Church Cathedral in Fredericton, well, famous building, probably the most famous building in Fredericton, a really significant Gothic revival building. And if you look at it, it's actually, what's really neat about this is it's an exact replica. This was built in the 1850s, by the way, of a 13th century church in Snettisham, England. And there you can see the two. The only little change you can see at the bottom of the steeple, there's a slight sort of gable bit that's different, but everything's on the window tracery, it's the same. And by knowing this, it tells you about the fact that the lineage, when you walk into this building in Fredericton, the bishop who brought an architect with him from England at the time in the 1840s, he asked him to copy and measure every single stone in England and then recreate it here. So when you walk into Christ Church Cathedral, yeah, it's a building from the 1850s, but you're effectively walking in 13th century England. That's a powerful statement to walk about it, because effectively you are. It's a replica of the building. One of the neat things too, when you think about architecture, that oftentimes people overlook certain aspects of it. I've written a few books the last little bit about stained glass, and think about the things that really make that evocation of color and of light. And certainly in a Gothic cathedral, stained glass is one of the most impressive sort of pieces, and they often have a really interesting history. So finding out whether there's sort of modern stained glass, like the piece on the left of the crucified Christ, which was done in the 1960s based on a French Art Deco mode, or something far more realist, which is on the right, which is from Memorial Hall at UNB, which I found out not long ago is actually based on Milton's Paradise Lost. So the stories that are in these are often interesting. And sometimes you'll get stained glass windows in a church which are actually secular. In a way, they're not religious at all. They have these interesting memorials. So if you ever go into a church, stop and take a look at the windows. There's often some of the most fascinating aspects of those that are in there. A lot of architecture, certainly up until kind of the mid 20th century, a lot of it was based on revivals of older styles from, the classical kind of like Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, where we use the term classical architecture, or revivals, Gothic revival, Romanesque revival. Things would always sort of come back, just like sideburns and tie-dye shirts. Everything is new again. This is a great example of a classical building. It's a house. It's a museum, but it's built as a house. It's in Woodstock, New Brunswick. And New Brunswick doesn't have a lot of classical revival houses like this, but when you look at it, what does it look like? It's a temple. It looks exactly like a Greek temple with some windows and shutters. And it's meant to, if you look at the columns that are in the middle, and you have this it's called an entablature around the kind of decorated frieze that's all around the outside, those match exactly the Parthenon, the Acropolis in Greece. I mean, in a way, there's no reason they should be on here, but the fashion in the mid 19th century was to make wealthy people make their houses, base them on Greek temples. Why was that? Just a sense of economic elevation, of importance. The fact that they were all white, you'll rarely see a classical building in the 19th century. They're all white because they would look back at the ancient Greek and Roman temples and see the stone as being white marble. What's interesting is they now know that all those buildings were not white. Just the paint has eroded off. They were all painted and multicolored like a rainbow. So they kind of got it wrong in the 19th century. They just didn't know. But what's interesting about this house, you can see in the front with the bronze plaque, it's a National Historic Site, Woodstock, here's just a little close-up of some of the classical detail, with the friezes up there. It's just pure Greek architecture and beautiful wooden buildings. In the Maritimes, obviously, we have a lot of wood, and that's an important part as well. It's not a lot of stone or brick in the Maritimes compared to other places in Canada, say like Ontario or Montreal. But what's interesting about this house, as you think of if someone's going to build their house and look like a temple, there's a certain amount of ego there as well. There's a certain amount of means and ego, but that this was built by, it's called the Connell House. Connell, who was the first postmaster in New Brunswick during the Victorian times, and he's infamous for putting his own face on a stamp, which was illegal at the time. Only the regent could do it. So here's the Connell stamp, which is one of the most famous and rare stamps in the world. So now it's rare you're going to get stamp collectors on your tour or something, but it's one of those things that that this is where he lived at the time, and it was this national scandal, and they had to pull all the stamps, which is why there was so much money. There's only about a dozen Connell stamps left, and they're worth tens of thousands of dollars. So right about this. I know you're going to Yarmouth for your conference in the summer. And when you look at, I really encourage you to go around and look at the wooden architecture. You get this sort of vernacular, which is a term means kind of really of its region, kind of untrained architecture, but doesn't mean it's any less. So oftentimes vernacular buildings are the most interesting. It really embodies the character of their place. And the architecture of the southern coast of Nova Scotia is actually very different from New Brunswick. You get the works here in Lunenburg, or sorry, in Yarmouth, but also in Lunenburg, which is a UNESCO National Historic District, a fantastic, fantastic place, famous for the Lunenburg bump. So, and it's unique. It's probably one of the most interesting towns in Canada. And really people go there for its architecture. The United Nations said is that those bumps were kind of a fusion of the Scottish and German immigrants that came there, brought their own kind of vernacular architecture together. They created something which is really unique, super decorative in Lunenburg. Looking back, one of the neat things, again, looking at sort of the social history of a lot of houses, when you think about a place, you'll often have these sort of, and Fredericton is guilty of this as well, of this sense of where their history, their kind of modern or contemporary history began. In Fredericton, they always talk about the Loyalists, and in many places in Canada, you know, after the American Revolution came up, that's sort of the start of our kind of non-Indigenous sort of European history. But the neatest thing in New Brunswick, the oldest house in New Brunswick is an Acadian house, which is actually from Fredericton. It's not here anymore, but it was moved to a kind of a historic village in northern New Brunswick. It's called the Maison Martin, the Martin House, from 1773, not long after the deportation. So, and actually the next oldest house was just outside of Fredericton too, another Acadian house. So the architectural history oftentimes belies the history of what people talk about. So when you talk about something like the Maison Martin, when you walk in, I mean, it's fascinating, but it's tiny. And, you know, I'm 6'3", I'm not a giant, but when I walk in here, I have to crouch over because you talk about how people were shorter then. People were about a foot shorter than normal. There's a pressed dirt floor. It wasn't necessarily they were super poor. It's just that's how the houses here were lived in, and they didn't have a lot of means. They had to build shelter very quickly. You know, didn't have flooring mills. A lot of them were hand hewn, and so to be speaking about the architecture of something like this in the Maison Martin, if you really dive into it, you can really get into the social conditions of the time, because architecture is an expression of its era better than anything else, better than literature, better than fashion, better than painting. It's all about the architecture. It speaks about economic means, family situations, social connections. When the Loyalists did kind of come into Fredericton, again, when they moved up here after the American Revolution, they didn't have a lot of means. And so the initial houses were very, very simple. And so this house from 1787, and they would have built their architectural dwellings very similar to the way they would have built them in the States when they would have kind of come up. And they didn't have the time or the means for doing any kind of decorations. So it was very, very simple, very elegant, but very simple. But by 100 years later, you start getting these kind of wedding cake, very decorated homes. Here's another little thing to talk about. If I asked a lot of people, what style would this house be? They would typically say Victorian. Well, it's technically wrong. There is no architectural style called Victorian. It doesn't exist. There's about 7 styles under the reign of Queen Victoria. You can say it. It's not wrong, but it's not right. This is actually a style called Second Empire, called Queen Anne Revival. And in that the listing I gave you, the illustrations, it kind of gives them there. About every 10 to 15 years under Queen Victoria's reign, an entirely new style came in and swept around. And they speak to the times, the economy, what influenced them, whether it was, you know, colonial discoveries or the world opening up or money, power. And this is interesting, the Edgecombe House. When you write about this as a Queen Anne, it's very, very kind of wedding cake, asymmetrical and so on. What's neat about this is the original house was basically like a very simple Loyalist house, which looked like this in 1820. And then someone bought it, a wealthy gentleman bought this house in the mid 1890s. And then what do you do when you renovate at the time? You funk it up, you make it speak to, you know, the style of the day, which in the 1890s was the Queen Anne Revival style. with these turrets, all these different kind of shingles. Now look, there's like actually 7 different kinds of wood siding on this. So the material richness of this, it's kind of overboard, but it works because it's so over the top. And you can see the original house underneath. They sort of plunk these things on, and it's actually a little bit clumsy. And you can even kind of say that writing about it. I talk about it. It's not the perfect because it was kind of this add-on, and it reads like that. Another thing, oftentimes that I find we'll talk about. I mentioned it earlier on with Montreal, with some of the modern buildings, is people tend to overlook some really interesting stories in sort of post-war structures. Now, I love pre-war and historical works, absolutely. But if you take a place like Hartland, New Brunswick, which has, I'm sure there's some, it's the longest covered bridge in the world. It's interesting, it's beautiful, but it's similar to other covered bridges, but it's really long. That's what makes it matter. 1 mile up the river is a far more beautiful and interesting bridge in a way. The Hugh John Fleming Bridge, which was built in 1960. And it used to be part of the Trans-Canada Highway till just a few years ago when it came up. But no one ever talks about that bridge. Even the town, when they write about it, they'll talk about the Carver Bridge because it should be famous as the longest in the world. But even in context with, I think, is most sculpturally one of the most interesting bridges in Eastern Canada. And one of the reasons is that one, you can see with this concrete arch, it's all structural concrete. It's actually based on some of the most famous bridges of the 20th century. This is by a Swiss engineer named Robert Maillard. And these are revered in France and Switzerland. And they're just considered some of the most beautiful structures of the 20th century. And we have our own version here in New Brunswick. And there's a couple others around Canada. Saskatoon has one. There's a few other ones around. But they're just beautiful. But they're overlooked because we as Canadians don't sort of see ourselves as kind of structural concrete engineers. It's hard for us to get, in the Maritimes, get past the covered bridgeness of it. So I'm not saying to take away from the Heartland Covered Bridge, but even if you're writing about it, say, and by the way, a mile upriver, within view of the bridge, is another important bridge. So you kind of have the pair of them. In Minister's Island in St. Andrews is one of the great shingle style buildings and kind of sections of, it's basically like a little enclave by the man that built the CPR. And he wanted to kind of get away, lived in Montreal, wanted to get away from his, the kind of the hustle and bustle and the smog of the city. So every summer he would go outside to St. Andrews into this shingle style. He had an island. It was actually a tidal island. You could only get there during low tide. And if I'm sure some of you have been there, some of you haven't, get thee to Minister's Island. It's a fantastic place. But one of the things you think of the shingle style, this house actually really helped introduce the shingle style, which was an architectural style during Queen Victoria's late reign. And it was based on America, where you would have these, at the time, wealthy Americans and wealthy Canadians started to have some leisure time and tons of money. So they started to build these summer homes on the coast. And they realized that what would weather best was if they covered them all with shingles. That style kind of had an introduction at the time. And they have these are some in Boston and Rhode Island, some very famous ones. And the one in St. Andrews, Minister's Island, is really one of the first shingle style mansions in Canada. And the architects were the Maxwell brothers from Montreal. And they're considered the first great important Canadian architects. Before that, wealthy people would always go to America to get their buildings designed, Boston, New York. But the Maxwell started to kind of shift that whole idea of getting that Canadians were capable of this. So Van Horn hired them to build a whole series of buildings beyond his house. It's one of the greatest barns in Canada on Minister's Island. And here are a series of bathhouse, windmill. So it's this really kind of eclectic collection. And I think if you ever go to Minister's Island, I've seen a number of things written about it, but I rarely see the people kind of go into the architectural history of why, and because he also built things over 30 years, and about how they kind of connect to what was happening with his life, with the change, the expansion of Canada, the railway, again, his sort of Dutch history. There's some really, really interesting things here beyond just saying, hey, it's a stone tower that looks like it's part of a castle. Well, yes, it is. But I mean, there's so much more interesting parts of that stuff. So I think sometimes taking it one step to dive a little deeper into history can give some really interesting things. Just like, but when you talk about, say, you go to a place like Venice in Piazza San Marco, I mean, one of the most historic squares in Europe, people rarely bring up the fact that Venice actually could have had a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And the reason they didn't, it was right on the Grand Canal, actually in this very spot in the photo down below, is the town didn't want to have what they considered a modern building. This was in the early 1940s. And you could imagine Venice, if it had, it would have been a beautiful stone building, a kind of great Frank Lloyd Wright building. So sometimes the architectural history, when you write about it, it's also sometimes writing about the things that didn't happen, or the buildings, say, that were there. It's also part of it as well, kind of getting into the narrative. One of the last things I'll talk about here is just a few examples of some other things. Talk about military architecture. When you drive right between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, there's Fort Beauséjour, which is one of the most important battles of the kind of the British takeover of the French colonies in the 1750s took place. You can hardly even see this. It's all this sort of earth-sheltered fort from the road, but it's really significant with its sort of basically bastions and its battlements and so on like that, which is all based on some really sophisticated engineering from France from the 1750s. So it's the kind of thing where some really, really significant military engineering was taking place in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and that manifested itself in Fort Beauséjour. Unfortunately, it only works if you have enough soldiers to kind of man it, and they were overrun by the British. But there's connections with this really important fort to some really important engineering in Europe as well. So kind of getting that other little story to kind of, I find connecting buildings in the Maritimes with precedents in Europe makes people go, oh, really? And it's interesting, but it also, in their mind, it makes it matter more. And I don't know if it's this kind of Canadian way that we often think things maybe don't matter as much because they're Canadian, but as soon as you can kind of connect something to a European or American lineage, it's not to kind of sell it, but that's part of its real history. And that's sort of where things came from. Like this, the Baroque, great Baroque churches of Germany, sort of post-Renaissance. I mean, just crazy, just vomiting of ornament in these places. They're stunning and gilded. I mean, I have no idea how they were even crafted at the time, but just an omnipresent ornament and excessive decor was the style of the early 1700s. You think, well, there's no way anything like that exists in certainly in Atlantic Canada or in a kind of poor Acadian farming community, but it actually kind of does. And if you go in a place called St. Isidore, which you would probably never go to, it's actually near Caracat in the Acadian Peninsula in the northeastern part of New Brunswick. It would have been a poor farming community of maybe 750 people. 100 years ago, they built this beautiful Baroque church. And so again, these things, it speaks about the faith that they had, but the importance of the church in these communities. They had a Quebec architect come in and design something. So it also talks about just the initiative, the confidence they had, but no one building a church like this and rubbing your kind of 5 cents together would have anything but absolute faith in the future. So why you build this? You look to the past for building the future. So I think there's kind of bigger stories, or you can just go and talk about the decoration. But what does this sense of decoration mean? They're connecting themselves to Europe, to religious history, but also building something that they see as permanent. And there's some real kind of depth into that. This is an interesting little story with some churches. I'm sure some of you have been to Grand Pré Historic Site in Nova Scotia, right outside of Wolfe. It's beautiful. But the church, which is meant to evoke kind of a rural French church of kind of the pre-contact era, it was actually the first building ever on a Canadian postage stamp. Back in the early 1930s, the building would have been effectively brand new, and then they put it on the postage stamp, which is kind of an interesting. Sometimes these little snippets like that can make things. So I say you don't necessarily have to worry about the dates and the architect, or commissions or so on. Those do matter, but sometimes the strange little things like this will stick with people. And this is a fascinating one too. And sometimes people can often get things wrong because they want things to be a certain way. And, it's okay too. But this is a beautiful modern church from 1965, post-Vatican II, in Rishabukto, which is a small town, kind of fishing town in mid-New Brunswick. It's about half an hour north of Moncton. So very Acadian, very Catholic. And if you look at the photo on the bottom, it's a circular plan. So it's very modern, round. And a lot of people look at that and they think, okay, fishing community, oh, that's like a shell. And, it's meant to be that, or waves on the sea. And the spire looks like a lighthouse. Oh, it's a lighthouse in the sea. Isn't that romantic? And they make, well, it actually wasn't at all. And again, I'm not going to go to the wire and fight if someone says that, but be careful what you wish for. The reason that is like that has nothing to do with the sea or a lighthouse. This is based on a restaurant, concrete shell. And that was concrete structure, by the way, that was done in Mexico only a few years before, which was one of the most published and advanced concrete shell structures of this kind of undulation geometric form by this engineer Felix Candela in Mexico City in 1958. They based it on that. It just happens to be near the sea. So one of the things I always say is don't try to kind of invent a history that seems lyrical, or sometimes that churches are built by ship carpenters upside down stuff. They're usually not. Find the real meaning behind the thing, and oftentimes they actually mean more and more interesting than something which seems kind of quick and flippant. So the fact that this is like a shell, well, no, but the fact that it was based on one of the most important engineering feats of the 20th century, that's a big deal, and that's pretty cool. And you can say it looks like a shell too, but it wasn't based on that. And just sort of closing off, one of the neat things too about architecture today is, my partner's father lives in St. Isidore. Oh, cool. We'll talk. It's a cool spot. I'm sure they've been to the church. Is how sustainability and kind of a more subtle humility is kind of coming into a lot of architecture now, which is less about being bold, huge, and heroic like the pyramids, but about connecting to the land, and about sometimes being a lot more quiet and less about kind of saying, look at me, but versus how they can kind of work itself in, to the experiences, as we have to become stewards of the planet. So these are two in New Brunswick, the Cape Germain, which is right at the edge of the Confederation Bridge to PEI. Most people don't stop here because it's in New Brunswick. They just want to get to PEI. But on the way back, it's a beautiful nature center that's right there on the edge of the water with a lovely boardwalk. And you can see that sort of walkway up there for this great vista overlooking the beach and the bridge. And then the Dune de Bactouche, which is, it won some significant international tourist awards a few years ago. Several kilometer long boardwalk and one of the longest sand dunes in Canada. I think even in the North Atlantic, it's a 15-kilometer sand dune. And all very ecologically sensitive, based on that. So I think even that idea that people want to go and visit places that are also responsible and really take their place very simply. And the last thing I guess I'll close with, and I've had the privilege of doing some books over the last 20 years on architecture, is I would just encourage you that if you're writing on a place, there's a lot of stuff you can get online too. Do some architectural research. There's a lot more writings on the architecture of small communities, whether they have, things that are kind of professionally written by historians, just to get kind of the real story. Again, to stay away from, just this sort of folk tales that sometimes sound interesting, but are oftentimes not. Again, if I see one more time that someone writes that the St. John Market, which is a beautiful 1870s building in St. John, and it's got this wonderful kind of wooden roof structure, and it was built by unemployed ship carpenters, which is total BS. All the ship carpenters were working building ships. It's just really sophisticated wood roof structure. Celebrate that. Is go and find the real story, and the stuff is out there. And here we go. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I think some of the things is seek out the stories that matter, the interesting things, because buildings are usually more than just history and dates. They're often deals with people that are nuanced, that are flawed, and those are the things that stay with people as well. And find a way to connect that into the architecture, why things are built that way. This is open to question. Now, this is a tough one to talk about because it's such a big thing. Architecture is a big thing that represents civilization. So how do you kind of frame it into something small? It's hard, but just to dig deeper, I think you'll find some really rich, invigorating stories to share. Anyway, I'm open to any Q&As.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful, insightful. My favorite part was what you said about how a place feels when you're standing in front of it. And I think as writers, that is a huge part of what we do. I love the horn reference to the church, but definitely something to think about when we're looking at buildings, especially those of us who are not experienced in architecture. But if anyone has any questions, I welcome you to unmute yourself or type it in the chat, and I can ask John, or he could just read it. Yeah, go ahead, please, Vanessa.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for putting this together for us. It's been incredibly helpful, and I've learned a lot, and it's given me a lot to think about. I'm wondering what your advice might be when often travel writers, we get assigned a very short brief, like do the top 5 things you must see in Paris or something like that. And it's not necessarily a lot of word space to allow for a deep dive or much creativity. And I'm wondering how you should approach buildings like, say, the Eiffel Tower or the Sydney Opera House, which everything that's ever been written about them feels like it's already out there. How can we add some depth or quality to our writing when we're sort of faced with such a monumental icon and the pressures of having very little space to work with? But it feels like I'm not exactly giving the readers much to go with when I say something like, oh, it's a beautiful building or an iconic building. Like, that doesn't feel like it's my best writing, I guess, for lack of.
I know what you mean. I think some of the things might be, if everything's been written on, does the world need another little paragraph on the Eiffel Tower? I don't think so. And what would you add anyway? But I think maybe what you could do is think about what's the neighborhood look like around the Eiffel Tower, and the places where you see the Eiffel Tower. One of the most important or impressive places in Paris, when you're under it, it's astounding. But across the river, there's a place called the Trocadero. It's the Palais. From that architectural area, that's this beautiful kind of symmetrical vista. It was built to honor the tower. Write about the tower, how it looks from there. And also you're surrounded by interesting buildings there. Is maybe just what's a different way you can look at the Eiffel Tower. I see the Eiffel Tower through this sort of very tight kind of canyon of houses together. I mean, something like that is but it's a hard one to answer, but I think is maybe free yourself that you don't have to, because people know it. Write about something else, or you can give it one line and then write about something else that's there that's interesting. There's a lot that's around there that's equally interesting. I don't know if that kind of does it. Sometimes the most important or interesting places are the ones that aren't written about. Like in Venice, the most interesting place is not St. Mark's Square. I've been there. It's cool, but it's not that interesting, really. It's the other small squares are. You could say, sure, everyone wants to go to St. Mark's Square, and you have to if you're there for the first time. But Campo San Peroni is far more interesting, and it's more genuine because the locals are there, and you can see bocce played there. That maybe leading into something else might be a way to think about it. Get people away from the real experience. I don't know. That's just a thought. I just see one of the comments. Ron Brown said, "I have written a book called The Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore." I have that book. That's a great book, Ron, and that's actually one of the first architecture books I ever got. So thanks for writing it.
Anyone else have other questions?
Yes, I do. I'm Helen in Halifax, and it's about like the architectural styles that go in and out of fashion and are celebrated maybe at one stage, but not another. Like the little house I live in is a prefab house that was built just after the war. And it wasn't fashionable to talk about it until about 20 years ago. People started talking about the prefab. So I know there's lots of neighborhoods like that. I know Sydney, Australia has a lot of neighborhoods like that too, where the houses weren't all that, and now they are. And here's one that I heard of about 3 years ago. A friend of mine pointed to a building in Plymouth in England and said, "Oh, that's a fine example of brutalist architecture." And I thought she was being funny, like, "Oh, isn't that brutal?" But I started Googling, and I now follow the hashtag on Instagram. And if you look in Halifax, for example, like right down the road from me, there's an ugly bank and like ugly Passover. And they're really incredible examples of like brutalist architecture. Would I write about that for my readers? I don't know. Like, I don't know if it's too quirky or what.
No, you know what? I think you do, because it's a style that was totally maligned. And just in the British were the ones, the British started this wave of reappreciating brutalism. 10 years ago, it was the most hated style ever. And the
Okay,
British,
so it's that recent.
yeah, and it's funny. I'm just joking. I know you say brutalist. That is actually its name. It's called brutalist architecture. So it's not. It sounds funny. It actually comes from the French term béton brut, which means rough concrete. So it just happens to be cursed with a name that has the word brutal in it, but it just means rough concrete. And in fact, one of the best examples of brutalism in Canada is the Dalhousie, the Rebecca Cohn Auditorium, the Arts Center. It's actually pretty good, but it's been hacked around a little bit, but that's, yeah, people are reappreciating that. So the weird thing in architecture is it's just been this way for centuries. We want to tear down what our parents built, but we want to keep what our grandparents built, because it takes a while to come around. And now we're realizing that brutalism is actually interesting. If you go to Toronto, Montreal, there's now brutalist architecture maps. And in Britain, it's a tourism draw again. The Barbican in London, they tore down a church in Moncton 2 years ago. It was probably the best brutalist church in New Brunswick because they didn't understand it. And so I think it's one of those things, as a tourist writer, some people would go, why are you writing about this? But younger readers would go, oh, this is great. Because it's just understanding your sensibilities change. And it's just being aware of that. Yeah. But everything goes out of style for a bit. As soon as it's done, everything we're doing today is going to go out of style in about 20 years. And if it can last about another 20 years after that, it'll be in style forever, right? That's just the way things go.
Thanks.
Can you speak a little bit to how we can find accurate sources when we're doing research for our work? When you mentioned the St. John City Market, my heart skipped a beat because 2 days ago, I just turned in my draft about St. John City Market to Canadian Geographic. And
oh God, did I offend you? Did you write about the ship's carpenters? I hope you didn't. Don't take that.
I did not. Thank the Lord.
Everyone else
does.
The
reason I didn't, of all things, is when I was doing my research and reading things on Wikipedia of all places, under like the little number for the citation, there was a question mark, and I'm like, this sounds like the typical maritime bullshit, which I feel like it says, because I grew up in Cape Breton. And so I'm like, this sounds like it's a bunch of nonsense. But I can completely see how many people would believe that, because of course it's the port city. Shipbuilding is a huge part of St. John. And so I'm like, well, thank God I dodged that bullet. But I'm like, given the fact that none of us are paid a whole lot of money for what we do most times, and research time is money, is there sort of a great set of sources and resources to investigate the history of buildings, or investigate architectural rumors, or things like that, so we're really being accurate in what we write, and also sort of being able to find the difference between sort of the fun, like rumors or urban myths, and then perhaps what's more realistic?
Yeah, you know what? The answer is yes, and I'm going to do something right now. I'm going to put it on the chat line. There's a thing called the Canadian Registry of Historic Places, and here you go, Canadian Register of Historic Places, and it's kind of volunteer driven, but there's like I think over 10,000 buildings all across the country. Like Toronto probably has 500 buildings on it. Fredericton has 50. Woodstock, New Brunswick might have 10. And the thing is, almost every building with even a remote sense of historical importance is listed on that. They have it's called the character defining elements, all the pieces about the building that matter. There's its history, its architect, its designers, and a short text about why it matters. So I'm actually going to put this in the chat right here. And if you're writing about any place anywhere in Canada, I would go here first, because if it's not on there, like say it's pre-war and it's not on there, 99% it's on there. So there it is right now. I just shared it, and I think I have to go to return. Yeah, there we go. So go on there. And if something is a National Historic Site, a lot of things now are on the web, but just if it's a National Historic Site, those are easy to find. But the register here, it's actually a great website. You know, and I don't know, there's other things, but say something like the St. John City Market is really just kind of Google it and you'll find some stuff, and watch out for just what other people have written, because you don't want to keep spreading the same thing. But if there's something that's sort of semi-official, like on a government thing, you just know the historians get the facts straight, right? There's been a lot written on it, but the registry is a good thing. So I would also encourage you to share that with your members as well, because some of them may not know about it. Like every single community in Canada has something on that registry.
Perfect. Yeah, Avery has a question about Banff specifically, and
Yes.
asking to have any databases or websites to start looking into this type of information. So Avery, there's a great start for you.
Well, I'm actually doing this right now. I'm actually just going to put the word Banff right on this, and let's see what comes up. How many things come up? 20 results come up on this. Oh no, 64 do. Yeah. So the first one, say Banff Springs Hotel. I click on it. Yeah, heritage value. Actually, you know what? Here, I'm going to share screen just for a second. If I can go back again. Okay, desktop, share. Okay, so here's the website right here. Whoop, I'm gonna go there. There it is. Okay, search the Canadian. I'm gonna shrink this just a bit. Search the register. I put Banff. Ooh. And then here it is, Banff. Oh, so somewhere in the national park. 64 results. I'm interested in. Hey, well, Banff Springs Hotel, National Historic Site of Canada. You click on that, there's photos, and then there's its construction dates, description of the place, its heritage value. There's a whole thing about its story, and these are the character elements. This is like a point form about all the things in it that are valued. So actually, this is a really valuable resource that I would go to. That's yeah. I don't know, search what's in I don't know, Yarmouth. Let's go to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Let's see what's up there. Okay. Oh, look at that. 118 places. Some communities are really big. So every place, Yarmouth is first hospital, Samuel Crowell House. Like they're all there. So I'd really encourage you to spend some time on that if you're going to a place before, and it's online.
And how is that information collected into that database? Like, I'm assuming not everybody can contribute to it, like an Atlas Obscura or something like that.
Well, what they do is they get the municipalities from cities, towns, and villages to give. So there'd be an agent, like Fredericton has an urban development department that has a heritage officer that they get them. I've actually been hired to do some of those for them. They actually pay pretty well. But small communities, they may have volunteers or historic groups, but they're all sort of vetted. Some are better than others, but they're all pretty good. They're all either pretty good to excellent. So you can typically trust that information that's on there.
Perfect. I will make sure we have that added to the resources that John has provided. That'll be on our National PD page. Does anyone else? Oh, we got another question from Avery. Is there any
protects these buildings? No, Canada has almost no heritage protection. It's unfortunate, but we just don't. There's very little. Even national historic sites are protected a little bit, but there's a lot less than you'd think, or funding for that. It's unfortunate. It'll change. It'll come around, but it's not there yet.
Awesome. Any more last minute questions? We are at 11 o'clock. John, that was perfect timing, and definitely started some insightful conversation for all of us writers.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And as I said, you can share my email with anyone. If anyone has a question or something, by any stretch of the imagination, don't be afraid to share.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
John.
Keep writing.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.